Hello there, my name is Florian and I welcome you to IT Tech Tips. In the last episode we've talked about users and groups, and in this episode we're going to use our knowledge about users and groups to create shares with access permissions, and I'm going to show you the connection between the file level permissions and the share permissions and how the most restrictive permissions always wins. This will be a quite detailed video, but you should watch everything to have the best possible learning experience. But if you don't have the time, you can skip to the summary, see the time marker in the description, in which I will summarize everything we have learned in this episode. But as I said, the best experience you will have if you do everything for yourself in our lab environment. Let's have a look. Before we can configure the share and the file access permissions, we do need a drive on which we can put the files. Of course, we could put the files just on the system drive C of acme-DC01, but this would be a really bad practice because if the system drive would fail, then all your data would fail as well. So what we're going to do first is to create a new virtual hard drive, which we can then mount into acme-DC01 and create the share on this drive. Let's do that. Make sure that only acme-router is running and all other systems are powered off. If you have that, you can click on acme-DC01 in VirtualBox, go to Settings, then to Storage on the left side. And as you can see, we have one drive controller here. So on this drive controller, we're going to attach a new virtual hard drive, which we have to create first. Go to the little plus icon on the bottom and create a new hard disk. And then select Create. We choose the type VDI, click Next, dynamically allocate it, and make sure that the path is within the same folder that the other hard drives of acme-DC01 are as well. Then we're going to rename the suggested file name to something more meaningful, like acme-DC01_data0. You can keep it at 50 gigabytes. This should be plenty for our testing purposes, and since it's dynamically allocated, it will only use a few kilobytes, not gigabytes, on your physical hard drive or SSD on which you create this virtual hard disk. So, now that you have it, as you can see, it's only 2 megabytes in size on your SSD. Select it and click Choose, and now it's listed in our virtual controller for the hard drives. So it will show up in the Windows Server 2019 as soon as we boot it up. Then click OK, and now we're ready to begin our configuration. Now that we have created our new virtual hard drive for acme-DC01, we're going to configure it in acme-DC01. For that, we have to start it. So make sure in VirtualBox you select acme-DC01 and select Start. Log in with the administrator. When everything has started, in the Server Manager, go to Tools and select Computer Management. Within Computer Management, on the left side, you see Disk Management. Go to Disk Management, and Windows will recognize that there's a new hard drive connected to this virtual PC. And the Disk Manager will ask you to initialize this new virtual hard drive. So select the disk 1, which is already checked by default. And since it's a pretty small drive, we keep it at MBR, Master Boot Record, which is the typical partition style for smart drives. Smart meaning smaller than 2 terabytes. Click OK. And now you see the disk is initialized, but it has not a file system yet. So the disk itself is present, but you cannot store files on the disk because you need a file system first. The file system is responsible for organizing the files and folder on a disk, and in most cases as well to set file permissions, so you can only access the files you're allowed to access. So we have to create a file system now. To do that, right-click on the newly created disk and select New Simple Volume. Click Next on the first page of the wizard and initialize it with the full size of this disk, which is approximately 50 gigabytes. Click Next and you can choose a drive letter here. The drive letter is the letter of the alphabet you see in Windows to access the disk's file system. We keep it at drive E and select Next. And on the next page, you can choose what kind of file system you want on this disk. There are 3 options available to you. exFAT is usually used for external hard drives, and exFAT does not provide any way to set file system permissions, so we do not want that. NTFS is the typical file system in a Windows Server environment. We're gonna use that in a few seconds. And REFS is a more modern file system from Microsoft, which has some advantages when it comes to a file system which is used for databases and high-speed access to a file system, but it lacks some features that NTFS has. So if you don't know what to take NTFS, you mostly cannot go wrong with that. So keep it at NTFS. And at the default allocation size, the allocation unit size is how large a virtual sector on the hard drive is. If you're interested in the topic file system and sectors and all the technical stuff, please leave a comment in the comment section and I will probably do a companion video to that. Keep it at default for the moment and enter a meaningful name for the volume. In our case, data. We will perform a quick format because otherwise it will take about 2 hours and blow up the drive space needed on our physical SSD. So do just a quick format please, and then click Next. Read through the summary page and click Finish. As you can see, the drive now shows up as drive E. That's what we've just created. Now we are all ready and prepared to finally begin to create our folders and shares. This part of the video will take quite some time because I will go into details of how the file system and the share permissions are interconnected and what the features of the Windows Server 2019 are and where you can probably go wrong if you don't know about these features. Please stick with me so you learn about all the traps you can probably fall into if you don't know it. Open the File Explorer and navigate to your newly created drive E. Right-click on an empty space and select New Folder, and we're gonna call our folder Shares. Double-click on Shares, create a new folder, and call it Management. Remember, we created a group management in the last episode. Also create a new folder and call it Marketing. And as the third folder, create a folder called Public. Then you navigate to our Active Directory Users and Computers management interface, which should be pinned to your taskbar if you followed the last videos, and navigate to Domain Normal Groups. Just as a quick repetition, I will show you what users are in each group, just in case you have missed the last video or forgot about the exact details. Remember which users are in which group. Now right-click on the folder Management and go to the tab Security. In the Security tab, click on Users and on Edit. As you can see, the users have by default read permissions on these folders. These are the file system permissions which are set by default when you create nothing at all after creating the new hard drive. try to remove the users by clicking on the users and on the remove button, and you will get a notification that you cannot remove or modify in any way this list of permissions because the permissions are inherited from the root folder. So if you want to modify something here, you have to disable the inheritance first so you can set permissions to this folder specifically. Click OK on the notification and on cancel, but only on the first window, and on the now open window management properties, select advanced in the bottom part of the window. Now here you have a lot more options than in the window we've just been in. For example, you can disable inheritance. So click on the button Disable Inheritance, and now you have two options. You can either convert the existing permissions, which are inherited from the root folder, to explicit permissions, so it's kind of a copy of the inherited permissions, or you can remove all inherited permissions and then the permissions list for this folder will be empty. But we like it nice and easy, so we convert the inherited permissions to be explicit on this folder, so we can simply adapt it a little bit and do not have to create everything from scratch. Click Convert and then OK. After you have done that, click again on Edit, and now you will be able to modify the list. So select Users and click Remove, because we do not want every user to have access permissions on the management folder. And now we're gonna add the group we want to have access permissions on this folder. So click on the Add button and enter Management, because we want our management group to have permissions here. Click Check Names to resolve our string to a real group name, and then on OK. As you can see, the default access permission for the management group is only read. But we want the group members to be able to modify content in this folder. That means creating files, deleting files, and of course listing files. So in the column Allow, select the checkbox Modify. You can scroll down the list to see what else is available. We just keep it at that and select OK. Now click on the Sharing tab on the top of the window. As you can see, the management folder is now created on the hard drive and the permissions on the file systems are set, but the folder is not available in the network yet because it's not shared yet. If you click on Share, you see that the management group is by default suggested because we created access permissions on the file system. Windows will recognize that and suggest that the management group should also have some permissions on the share. So click on Management and select Read Write. Then click the Share button. As you can see, Windows will tell us what's the share name which is available on the network. Remember that name, we're going to use it in a few minutes, and select Done. Then you can close the wizard and select the properties of the marketing folder. Again, go to Security, disable inheritance and convert the inherited permissions to explicit permissions. Click OK. Edit the list, remove the users group, and add the employees group because we want to have the members of the employees group to have access to the marketing folder. Check names, click OK, and give them modify permissions. Also, we're adding the management group because we also want the members of the management group to have permissions to the marketing folder, and we also give modify permissions to the management group. Click OK. Go to the Sharing tab and click on Share. As you can see, we also have some suggestions from Windows here. We're going to change. Select Read and Write for both of these groups. Click Share and remember the share name which is shown here. Then click on Done. Close the wizard And we're also going to set permissions to the public folder. As before, disable inheritance, remove the users group. And since this is a public folder, we're going to add the domain users group, which is a default group in the Active Directory, which contains all users by default you create in the domain. So if we add the domain users group here, every user in the domain will be in this list by default. Of course, if you create a user, as we have seen before, you can remove this user from the domain users group, but typically the domain users group contains all users in the domain. So click check names, then OK. And we want every user to have modified permissions since this is a public folder. Go to the sharing tab, click share and select read write as access permissions to the share for the domain users group. Remember the share name, click done and close. Here's a quick repetition of the groups with their members and the shares we have just created and set permissions to. Alright, now we're gonna have a look at how this works on the clients. Go to Oracle VirtualBox and start Acme-Client 01. In case there's still the client admin from our previous episodes in the logon window, select Other User and enter our domain user Donald.Duck. Donald.Duck. Enter our highly secure password and log in. Now open the File Explorer, and as you can see, the share is not connected here. That's not surprising because we have not created any login script or group policy which would connect the share to the client computer. So to check that we have access to the share, you can click in the address bar on the top of the window and enter /acme-dc01 / and here you see a list of the shares we have created, and we're going to choose public. It's empty because we have not created any files. Right click and create a new file. Call the file what you like. I called it hello world and enter some string, some data and save the file to check that you have right permissions to this file. That seemed to work fine. If you go to the marketing share, do the same test, create a new file, call it whatever you like. Enter some text in the file and check that you really have right permissions. And do the same test in the management folder, but as you can see, you will not have access to the management folder because Donald.Duck is not a member of the management group, but he's a member of the employees group. And in the management folder, only the members of the management group have access. So we have also proven that the denial of an access works. You can close the error message. And we're going to do some testing on Acme-Client 02. Go to Oracle VirtualBox, click on Acme-Client 02 and start it. Here we're going to log in with our user Dagobert.Duck. Dagobert.Duck is a member of the management group. Since this is probably the first time that Dagobert.Duck is logging in to Acme-Client 02, it will take some time on your system. I sped up the whole process in this video. If the login is complete and the profile is created, open the File Explorer as before and navigate to the share /acme-dc01 / management. Right click in the empty space and create a new text document. As you can see, Dagobert.Duck was able to access this share because he's a member of management and management has permission to access this share. Also, Dagobert will be able to write some text in this file and save the file. Now it's a little bit inconvenient to access the shares via the address bar of the File Explorer. So it would be easier if we had a drive letter which we could access and the shares were in this drive letter. So what we're going to do is we're going to map this share to a drive letter. And that we can do with the command prompt, or a login script, or a group policy object, or in the Windows 10 network environment you could right click on a share. I'm going to show you the way how to do it with the command prompt. So right click on the Windows logo, select Run and CMD, command prompt, and enter the command net use, then the drive letter you'd like to use for this share. In our case it's M, column, then the share name, / acme-dc01 / management. Click enter and you will see that the share was connected successfully. If you now go to the File Explorer, you will notice that you have the drive letter M, which you can double click, and you have the same share than before when entering it manually in the address bar. See, it's the same. What you could also do is dragging and dropping the share that you have entered in the address bar to the quick access. This would work as well if you don't want to waste any drive letters. Again, you see, it's the same. We now have tested the access to our shares from both of our clients, Acme-Client 01 and 02, using two different user accounts which are in two different groups, and the groups have different permissions to the shares. You may have noticed while we were creating the shares that the sharing wizard suggested the groups with permissions right within the wizard. And the suggestions originate from the permissions we have set to the groups on the file system. This sounds great at the first glance, but usually as an IT professional you want more control over that, and I will show you the disadvantages of this connection between the file system permissions and the sharing permissions and why you do not want that in the future. So bottom line, using the sharing wizard is bad, and using the advanced sharing is the recommended way to do it. To prove that, please go back to the Acme-DC01. You may need to log in again because the session timed out, and go to the place we created our shares in the file system. Now let's create a new share as a showcase for what I've just told you. Create a new folder, call it test share, right click on it and choose security. As we did before, advanced, disable inheritance, and then remove the users group and add a new user called Donald Duck. In this case we add a user and not a group because it's just a short test. And as you can see, the user Donald Duck got by default the read permissions. And we're gonna check the checkbox modify. And now we go to the sharing tab and again use the sharing wizard, and as you see, Donald Duck got the suggested sharing permissions contribute. We're now going to change that to just read. Then we click on the share button, and what you would expect as an IT professional is that Donald Duck now has read permission on the share and modify permission on the file system. Click Done and close. Now go back to our Acme-Client 01 where Donald Duck should still be logged in, and go to the test share we have just created. Then jump back to Acme-DC01, go into the test share we have just created and create on Acme-DC01 a text document called Hello World or whatever. As you can see on the left side of the window, in the Acme-Client 01. While we are creating it on the server with about 2 seconds latency, it also shows up on the client. Go to the properties of the test chair and double check the security of Donald Duck. As you can see, it's now only read but not modify. Remember, a few seconds ago we checked the modify checkbox on the file system permissions, and then we used the sharing wizard and modified the share permissions from contribute to just read. So the sharing wizard obviously modified the file system permissions without asking us as administrators back to just read. If we now go back to the sharing wizard and change to read write, close the sharing wizard, and then open the just created text file on Acme-Client 01, write something in it, click save. You would expect the saving to fail because you have read-write permissions on the share, but supposedly only read permissions on the file system. Remember, when we left the security tab on the file system permissions on test chair, it was just on read and not on modify. Then we went to the sharing wizard and changed from read to read write and click share. So as you can see, the save was successful, which is not the expected behavior. It should have failed because on the file system you did not have, or you should not have, permissions to save this file, despite you said on the share that you can write. So because the most restrictive permissions wins. So if you have full access on the share but only read access on the file system, the user will only have read access. Vice versa, if you have only read access on the share and full access on the file system, the user will only have read access. Let's try something else. Go back to the server, choose the properties of the test chair, go to the security tab, and as you can see, Donald Duck now not even has modify permissions, but full permissions, which is way more permissions than we wanted to give him. So the sharing wizard did that without notifying us. Of course, we're going to edit that back to the way we want it. So remove full control and modify from Donald Duck, also the write permission. Then click OK. Go back to the sharing tab. As you can see, it switched back from read write to read, which is the suggestion. But this time we click on cancel because we are not using the sharing wizard anymore. And we click on the button below the sharing wizard, which is called advanced sharing. As you can see, the share is already there because we created the share before using the sharing wizard. Also notice the checkbox share this folder, and here you have a permission tab. As you can see, by default everyone has full control, and this is a good thing. This sounds like excessive access permissions, but actually it is best practice to share to everyone with full control permissions and do the access permission on file system level. This way you have never a confusion between which write supersedes which other write. So in share, everyone full control, and on the file system, the restrictive permissions you actually want. Of course, you need a file system which allows for access permissions. So exFAT, which I showed you rather at the beginning of the video, would not have been a possible solution for our scenario because exFAT does not support file system permissions. Click OK and OK again in the advanced sharing window and on close. So the expected behavior now would be that Donald Duck only has read permissions because he has full control on the share, but only read permissions on the file system. The most restrictive permission wins. Let's test that. Go to acme-client 01, change something in the content of the file, then try to save it, and it will not allow you to save to the share. That's why Notepad pops up a new Save As window, because it's not allowed to save in the place the file is opened from. You can click Cancel because you will not be able to save. You can close the text file and then try to delete it, which will also not work because you don't have delete permissions. So this was the proof of the connection between the sharing wizard and the file system permissions, and why you should not use the sharing wizard, but the advanced sharing only. So far we have created 3 shares plus the test share. Each share in our scenario would have to be accessed separately, so in a Windows environment you would waste 3 drive letters for accessing the shares, as I showed you with the user Dagobert doc. That's not good, because in the alphabet we only have so many letters, and the letter C is used usually, the letter D is used usually, and if you attach an external optical drive, another letter gets used. If you attach a USB hard drive, another letter gets used. So it's really limited. Also, it's problematic because for some groups you will have drive letters which overlap with the drive letters of other groups, and it's really a pain in the ass to organize everything in a larger environment. So what you want to do is create preferably only one share with many subfolders, and the permissions are then set on the subfolders and not on the share. So the client can access one share with one drive letter, and will see or not see, depending on how you configure it, many subfolders, to some of which he or she has access, and to others he or she has no access. That's what we're going to configure now. Go to the server acme-dc01, where we've created our 3 shares plus the test share, and open a command prompt and enter net share. This command will give you a list of all shares which are created on this server. So that's an easy way to find out where we have created shares, because sometimes you will have shares on the server which you don't know about, or which another administrator created temporarily and then forgot to remove, which is a security risk. And with this command you can find out about that really easy. Alright, now you have seen the shares we've created, and now open the properties of the management share. Go to sharing, advanced sharing as we've learned, and uncheck the checkbox share. So this folder will not be shared anymore in the network. You might get a warning that one of the clients or several of the clients are still connected to the share. When you remove a share in a real-life scenario and you have users still connected to it, they will all be disconnected and they will probably lose some work which they did not save. Click Close. Do the same with the marketing share and the public share. And the test share we will not need anymore in the future, so we can just delete that. So we are left with our 3 folders which are not shares anymore, and we're gonna have to create a share in which we can put these folders. So again, open a command prompt to test what we just did, enter net share, and now you see that the list is much shorter because we have just removed 4 shares. 3 by unchecking the checkbox, and the 4th by just deleting the folder. Now go to acme-client 01 and double check what we've just did on the client side. So in the address bar, enter / acme-dc01 / and then you will get a list of the shares which are publicly available on the server. And it's only 2 default shares which are created by default when you install an Active Directory domain controller. Jump back to the server, close the command prompt, and now we're gonna share the root folder shares. So right click on it, go to properties, and then on sharing, and of course we're using advanced sharing, and now we're gonna share this folder. Shares is a good name for our lab, and everyone full control as usual. Click OK. Once again on OK, and close the window. So if we now go to shares, open the properties of the management, and we're gonna double check that the sharing of the root folder has not changed any file system permissions on the management folder. That was the issue we had with the sharing wizard before. That's why we've learned not to use the sharing wizard. Go to the Security tab, select the management group, go to Edit, and set the correct permissions because they were set before by the sharing wizard, and now we have to correct it. We didn't correct that a few minutes ago. Click OK. Now the management group has modified permissions on this folder. Here you see from our exercise before that the permissions are already correct. You can click on cancel, and in the public folder you also see that the permissions are set correct. They're on modify for all domain users. Now jump back to acme-client01. Again, in the address bar, enter / acme-dc01 /, and now you have one additional share called shares. That's the one we've just created. Access it, and you will see the 3 subfolders which had been shares before. We now change from several unique shares to one share containing the subfolders. Open the public folder, open the marketing folder, and try to open the management folder. And as before, when the management folder has been a unique share, you get an error message that you do not have access permissions to this folder. So security-wise, we are safe and sound, but it's now much easier for the users to connect to the shares because they only need one drive letter and maybe in the future an additional drive letter for their personal home directory, but that's another topic for another episode. You can close the error message and open a command prompt on acme-client01, and we're now going to manually map this share to a drive letter. So as before, use the command netuse. This time we use the drive letter G, column, //, then the path to the share, // acme-dc01 / shares, and hit enter. You will now in the File Explorer, after a quick refresh, have the drive letter G, which you can access, and it's the same as before. When we accessed it manually, no access permissions to the management folder on purpose, but the other folders work. As I said in the introduction, I will summarize now this lengthy episode into a few important bullet points so you have the best possible learning experience. First, we have created a new data drive for our acme-dc01 server. We've created it in VirtualBox and then mounted it in the server, where we had to initialize the drive using the master boot record and creating a file drive using the file system NTFS. It's important to remember that not all file systems support setting access permissions on the file system. You must make sure that you use a file system which supports access permissions, like NTFS. I generally recommend using NTFS as a file system in a Windows environment. REFS is a more modern file system from Microsoft, but it lacks some features that NTFS has. If you set permissions on a folder in an NTFS file system, the permissions are inherited by all subfolders of this folder by default. To find out which permissions a user or a group effectively has, you have to consider 2 types of permissions. the file system permissions and the share permissions. The most restrictive permissions wins. For example, if you have on the share everyone full control and on the file system you have just one group, for example management, with modify permissions, then the management group will have effective permissions of modify on this share and everybody else will have no permissions. So let's quickly recap the best practices we've learned in this episode. You should not use the sharing wizard on the top of the window on this screenshot, but you should use the advanced sharing feature on the bottom of this window. It is best practice to set everyone full control permission to the share, which sounds insecure, but it's not, because you will set the file system permissions restrictive and the most restrictive permission wins, as we've learned on the last slide. You should always, if possible, assign access permissions on the file system to security groups, because you will lose control over your whole permission settings if you start to assign access permissions to users directly. Assign permissions to groups on the file system. It's also considered best practice to use as few shares as possible and work with subfolders within these shares, and on the subfolders you set the access permissions to your groups. The reason for that is simple. In a Windows environment you will use a drive letter per share if you mount it, and there are only so many letters in the alphabet and you should not waste them. So that's it for today's episode. You should now have a pretty good understanding about share permissions and file system permissions and how they work together. And we've practiced a lot with accessing the shares from our clients. In the next episode, which will be shorter, we will use logon scripts to connect automatically these shares to the client computers as soon as a user logs on, which is then much more convenient for the user than accessing the share by typing in the command in the command prompt or using the address bar. So if you don't want to miss the episode, subscribe and ring the bell. If you like this video, please click the like button. Stay tuned. See you next time.